Hi, everybody, and welcome back to OMN Insights. My name is Suriti Kadir. I'm your host. And before I introduce today's guest and topic of discussion, we're going to watch a short advertisement.
Ashama kun sagalee bridge reality garee Samu'eel Birhaanuti. Manni jireenya dhala namaaf ni barbaachisa. Inni kun garuu jireenya tulbuu horee yaada namaa boqochiisa. Gaaddisa aara galfii ta'ee jiraachuuf nama sassachiisa. Maarree isinis kan akkanaa bitachuu yoo feetan akkasumas kan ofii qabdan gurgurtanii bu'a qabeessa ta'uun gara xiqqaatti yookaan gara guddaatti jijjiirrachuu yoo barbaaddan dafaa mariisisaa. Bridge reality. Toora bilbila keenya torba ja'a sadii torba afur afur saddeet sadii ja'a lamarratti nuuf bilbila. Bridge reality garee Samu'eel Birhaanuti.
Today, we are joined by Professor Temesgen Kasai, who is the Assistant Professor at the Norwegian School of Leadership and Theology. And we are going to be discussing the political conditions and challenges faced by the Tigray region post the signing of the Pretoria Agreement. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Temesgen.
Thank you for having me today. I'm really happy to be.
Good. I'm happy to have you. So, Professor Temesgen, in an article you wrote for Tigray Media House, you said that, and quote, the Tigray war demands accountability, not only to address past violations, but also to prevent a relapse into further war. Developments following the Pretoria Agreement clearly indicate that accountability is being intentionally evaded by both domestic and international actors. Professor Temesgen, why do you think that this accountability is being evaded? And what would be the consequences for these domestic and international actors if accountability was taken seriously? And as you answer that, you can also let us into or give us some insight on what adequate accountability would look like.
A lot of questions at the same time.
Sorry.
I want to start with what has happened in Tigray during the war. I think a lot of news have been released about what has been happening, both about the massacre, the rape, or when I say rape, an industrial scale rape, and also displacement. And we have seen, we don't have exact numbers, but there has been estimates that more than 600,000 people have died in the course of the war, and there has to be an accountability. Someone has to take responsibility for what has been done, and the people that have suffered the consequences need to be to get both accountability and justice, because without justice, without accountability, there is no real peace, there is no real reconciliation. And what we have seen today, or so far since the signing of the peace agreement, the developments since the peace agreement in Pretoria in November, and doesn't go to the direction of meeting this quest for justice and accountability. I can cite several developments that provide at least some sort of context. And I think the question why is accountability not at the top agenda is, I think we need to look to the people or the parties that have signed the peace agreement, the Ethiopian federal government and the TPLF. And the Ethiopian government is the main culprit or the main perpetrator of the massacre, the rape, the starvation, and the siege. And but at the same time, when they come to the terms of agreement, they are the primary signers or the primary parties that are signed. So I don't think so. There would be critical, or they would be interested to investigate themselves or make themselves accountable for the crimes that they have committed. And I think that's also one of the things that with the TPLF itself, there have been war crimes that have been committed both in Afar and in Amhara, And also, it's also a sort of evading responsibility and accountability for these crimes also. And I think the two parties come together and they came light on their own culpability or on their own role in what has happened in the last 2 years.
So there's what you're describing is an obvious conflict of interest in terms of there being desire and being able to establish process to achieve this accountability. So from your perspective, if there was to be a process established to seek out this accountability, would it need to be facilitated by third party, either institutions or states, or would it be facilitated by civil society in Tigray or in its diaspora? What could that process look like?
The optimal way would have been a third party, a neutral party that have a full access to the sites where the massacre, to the victims, would have been the ideal situation to have accountability and justice. But what we have at the moment is, since both parties have signed, and especially the primary party in this agreement, the Ethiopian government, still denies the possibility of clear investigation, for example, and also has not granted access to investigators, media, and Tigray still remains out of reach. And a true justice or accountability needs a third party, parties that are not involved or that are not implicated in the crimes that have happened in the last 2 years. At the moment, we don't have that in place.
At the beginning of your answer, the first answer that you gave us a little bit of context in terms of the severity of this war that lasted 2 years, really what was a genocide. So in the context of something, an event that lasted so long, where so many lives were lost, where bodies were used as a battleground for war intentionally, purposefully, what can accountability look like for victims or for Tigray overall? I mean, what are some of the outcomes we would be looking at? Is it reparations? Is it some sort of rearrangement in political power in terms of the people who perpetrated these crimes? Is it them being taken to through some kind of court process? I mean, what is that? What can that accountability be?
I think the first is to recognize what has happened, especially for the victims, for the people that have lost their own family members, the women that were raped, for the children that have lost their parents through massacre. And I think the first step would be to recognize to recognize the pain that has been caused upon these people. Then I think the second step would be to redress what should be done to address the question of justice for these people that have paid the price. And that would include bringing the perpetrators to account for what they have done, but also especially address or redress to the victims. It could be compensation. It could be providing both physical and different mechanisms to meet what they have lost, and also to help them recover back to their normal life, or to the life that they had before the start of the war. And I think that is a very important, because at the moment what we are seeing is the victims that have paid the price are not in the picture. In these discussions about peace and moving on forward, they are not at the center of the discussions. In fact, there's this urge to move on without properly addressing and listening to their voices. And I think that's one of the fears that I have, is there's this desire to move on without even knowing the depths of the pain or the extent of pain that have been carried out in Tigray in the last 2 years.
I really hear you on that, Professor Temesgen. So moving on, there have been a number of large-scale political developments over the last few weeks in regards to this peace process in Tigray, and namely the announcement of the interim admin, Getachew Reda, as its leader, and the subsequent push to return the region back to a sense of normalcy, if for lack of a better term. In late March, soldiers from the Tigray Defense Force that had been made disabled during the war and were being sheltered in military camps came out to protest for basic necessities like medical care and food. Though Getachew Reda assured protesters that their demands would be met, stating in an interview with Addis Standard that injured members of the Tigrayan fighters raised a serious issue of lack of food, hygiene, and medical treatment, and it has to be investigated and is being taken very seriously. Protesters were also reportedly tear gassed during these demonstrations. So in all of the efforts to come out on the somewhat other side, again, for lack of a better term, of this war, since the Pretoria Agreement that was signed in November of last year, how does something like the basic needs of the people who fought and were made disabled during this war get so seriously overlooked?
I think this is also an indicator of the absence of provision, or the lack of provision, especially for the most vulnerable members in society. What has happened in Tigray, especially, this is the first, I think it's a very unique event that the veterans demonstrated something that's not common within the Tigrayan political culture. Even if often people don't take it to the streets, that's not a common thing that we see. But the veterans have reached a limit, or they were pushed to the edge that their needs were not met. They were lacking food, basic services, treatment for their wounds, and also other basic needs that they had. And I think that also shows, I think it could be two factors. The first is there's enough resources to meet their needs, but these resources are not directed toward them, or directed to meet their needs. And I think that's also where we see now. The second could be overall, there has been a lot of siege, and there has been a restriction of aid. So as other members of the Tigrayan society, they are suffering. So their suffering is not unique. But I think I would say to the first factor that they have been neglected. And this is not the first time in the long history of veterans being mistreated, both within the Tigray context and also in the Ethiopian context.
When you say it's not the first time that this is in the context of Tigray specifically, I know you mentioned Ethiopia as well, that veterans have been mistreated or marginalized. Can you say a little bit more on that? Because what I find very telling about this situation is that what I understand is that the TDF is mostly made up of everyday people who were spurred into action because of the intensity of the genocide over those 2 years. And so them being forgotten in this process, I think really speaks to what you've been talking about in terms of everyday people, the people who have suffered in this war, being the last to be thought about as we go through this political change. But when has this happened in the past, and what did it look like in the past in terms of the dynamic between the fighters and the CPLF or the party?
The immediate reference that comes to my mind is the post-Ethio-Eritrean war. And at that time, there were also a lot of young people that have joined the war. And some came back like injured and lost their body parts. And they were not given proper treatment either, even at that time. And there was a lot of promise, both given officially and formally, but those promises were never implemented in practice. And in fact, I tried to kind of give you some context. Some of these promises were quite generous, that the veterans were borrowing money, even just in the hope of receiving money, or in the hope of receiving help. But quite a lot of them ended up without getting any compensation from government. And I think there is this a trend. I would say again, I think because this doesn't happen often, but there is a historical record or a past precedent that also gives us a context that often people that have joined the army either out of necessity or just because they want to join the cause, when they come back, they are not given the first priority that they need or they deserve. And this is not the first time this is happening within the context of Tigray.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that insight, Professor Temesgen. Moving our conversation in a little bit of a different direction. In the wake of the genocide beginning in Tigray, there was an effort by both the Tigrayan and Oromo communities, particularly in the diaspora, to engage each other in solidarity. This was also reflected in the military alliance that the OLA and the TPLF formed at the end of 2021. During the war, in my capacity as an activist, I'm speaking a little bit from a personal perspective here, I bore witness to a difference of opinion, I guess I could say, amongst the Tigray activist and political community about how, in order for this solidarity to be built, how much conversation should be had about the TPLF's role in state violence in Oromia in the nearly 3 decades that it was in power, and the lack of engagement or, I guess, sensitivity from the Tigray community in regards to violence in Oromia in the EPRDF era, but also in the Abiy era before the genocide began in Tigray. The sentiment that I would often come across was that this is a conversation that should happen, but it should happen after Tigray is out of the thick of war and genocide, which I think is fair and just. But can you share your thoughts and insights on these dynamics? And what can solidarity look like now that Tigray has reached the stage that it has, and Oromia is still very much deep in the throes of war with all of the actors that fought in Tigray or were committing genocide in Tigray?
I think when the war started, maybe I have just followed mainly the conversation on social media. And there has been a lot of solidarity, especially I've seen a lot of both prominent figures in the Oromo community standing together with the Tigrayan community, despite what has been experienced when the TPLF was in power. But when the wars started to develop or came to end, that solidarity has kind of waned or decreased and has become more of a kind of a rivalry or become more antagonistic. And of course, there are many reasons or many factors that kind of explain why the way it has developed, the way we see it. But the question of addressing what the TPLF has done during when it was in power, it's a very difficult question. I can't speak for all Tigrayans, but I can speak a little bit of the culture or the political culture in Tigray, or the dominant political culture in Tigray, that what the TPLF has done during power or what is doing not only in the rest of Ethiopia but also within Tigray is a sort of a taboo. It's not subject for discussion. And I think that also explains why there is this strong hesitation to speak of evil or what the TPLF did when it was in power. I understand that during war, I think the focus was to survive as people, to survive or defend Tigray together. So there is no particular consideration to address the past grievances, the past atrocities or crimes that have been committed by the TPLF. But generally, I can speak about the Tigrayan political culture that even in times of peace, even now, there's this reluctance to speak about what the TPLF is doing or has done both to the people of Tigray or to the rest of Ethiopia. And I have tried to raise some critical questions, but often the focus is to shut down the conversation rather than address what the TPLF has done when it was in power, rather than critically examine its role and also have some real genuine conversation. And I think that is also the reluctance that I see, especially some of the main activities that we see on social media, trying to shield the TPLF at any cost. And this is a very dominant discourse that I'm also quite aware that exists within the Tigrayan political culture today. And
go on.
Yeah, so if there is no genuine interest or dialogue about the TPLF and its role, both when it was in power and now, and also recognize the suffering it has caused for other communities, I don't think so there will be a genuine dialogue with other communities. And the prospect of solidarity will be, it will be more of alliance, a strategic alliance than real genuine solidarity.
So you think that this is actually a matter of us addressing our cultures of conversation and our cultures of politics to be able to open up space to make these criticisms or make these analyses that might, again, direct criticism towards these sort of vanguard parties. So that's what I'm hearing here, is that it's actually the culture of politics that has to shift for us to be able to move towards genuine solidarity?
Yeah, because again, I can't really speak for other communities, and I don't also speak for every Tigrayan, but I can speak of the general trend that I see when I see some people raising some critical questions about the TPLF. The focus is always shifting the goalpost. You don't criticize the leaders, you don't criticize the party, you don't criticize its policy. And often, even within Tigray, the political culture is just to keep it as it is. Sometimes it's kind of, in the name of keeping the unity, or it's in the name of preserving some sort of image for the outsiders. And I think that's also the reason why there has been a lot of unjust things that have happened under the TPLF within Tigray, but they are not addressed. Corruption, there's press freedom and violation of human rights. They happen regularly, but they are not addressed because of the political culture itself is not honest about itself, or honest about the people or the party that has been running Tigray for the last 30 or 50 years. And if there is no genuine interest about to question what is the dominant, or if the people ignore the elephant in the room, I don't think so. There's a kind of a possibility also to build a genuine solidarity with the other communities that have been also receiving the same crimes or the same practices. So I would say, I think it starts both kind of being more self-critical and not to take it to the negative side, but at the same time, we need to be aware of the role the party has played both in shaping the situation in Tigray and also across Ethiopia.
I think that these challenges that you are talking about are definitely relatable across communities in Ethiopia. And I think the analysis of the TPLF's time and power over that 27-year period is definitely not as simple as, the TPLF violating in Oromia. There were many other actors involved, including Oromo parties and people itself. So it's not an easy analysis to make, nor an easy conversation to have. But I really sincerely appreciate your insights on this matter, Professor Temesgen. I appreciate your time today. Thank you, and I look forward to hopefully talking to you again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're most welcome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, everybody. I hope you found that conversation with Professor Temesgen as insightful and as enriching as I did. I look forward to being with you again next time. You are watching OMN Insight. My name is Soreti Kadia, and I'm your host.
hawaasa Oromoo biyya Kanaadaa magaalaa Toronto finaannoo shajiraataniif OMN waxabajjii 17 bara 2023 Toronto waltajjii marii hawaasaa OMN Community Engagement qopheessuu wajjin beeksisu gammachuu guddaadhaan guyyaa kanatti daayirektarri olaanaa OMN Dajanee Guutamaa fi Aadde Naadiyaa Abbaa biyyaa keessummoota kabajaa ta'uun gidduu keessanitti argamu dhimma waloo uummata keenyaa fi gahee adda durummaa OMN akka miidiyaa Oromootti bahaa jiru akkaataa cimsuun danda'amu irrattis isin waliin mari'atu. Marree waxabajjii 17 bara 2023 sa'a tokko yookaan 1 PM irraa eegalee beellamni keessan waliin haa ta'u jecha guyyaa kanatti qaamaan dhiyaachuun miidiyaa keessan akka tumsitan boriifis humna OMN ta'uu keessan akka mul'iftan kabaja guddaan isin affeerree jirra. Bakki walgahii High Park Area 4 teessoon 1873 Bloor Street West on M6R 2Z3 Canada. Bakki yaa'ii filan paarkii guddaa giddugala bashannana daa'immanii of keessatti hammate waan ta'eef ijoollee keessan qabadhaa kottaa qaamaaf qalbii guutuun waliin dabarsaatin odeeffannoo dabalataaf gama lakkoofsa bilbilaa keenya 64701 yookaan 64745 koree qindeessituu sagantichaa quunnamuu dandeessu. OMN ijaa fi gurra uummataa.